Hi, everyone. Hello. Welcome to Riskline's webinar on the future of travel bubbles in APAC and beyond. Before we start, just a few general housekeeping rules. So this webinar will be recorded and made available to all attendees. So you don't have to worry about taking down notes during the presentation itself. And you can enter your question first in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about Riskline, get in contact with us at contact@riskline.com. So my name is Aaron Kunaraja. I'm Riskline's Business Development Manager based in Melbourne, Australia. Joining me in this webinar is Ramya Dilip Kumar. She's a Senior Political and Security Risk Analyst, and she is based out of Melbourne as well. And she heads our APAC coverage team. So without further ado, let me invite Ramya to start her presentation. Go ahead, Ramya.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ramya Dilip Kumar, and I'm in Riskline's APAC team. Today, I'll be speaking to you about travel bubbles. To start with, let's look at some trends in the global business travel industry since the pandemic hit. Global spending on business travel decreased by around 52% to $694 billion in 2020 from 2019 levels, according to GBTA. International arrivals worldwide fell by 74% in 2020 from year-ago levels, according to the UN World Tourism Organization. And the global airline industry incurred a loss of about $118.5 billion, out of which the airline industry in APAC alone lost around $29 billion in 2020 compared with year-ago levels, according to IATA. So against this backdrop, countries which managed to largely contain the outbreak by the end of 2020 started to explore different recovery models to safely resume cross-border travel, which led to the creation of travel bubbles. So what is a travel bubble? A travel bubble is a zone created between two or more countries where residents can travel safely without many quarantine restrictions. And usually travel bubbles are created between countries which have largely contained the outbreak to mitigate the risk of further spread of infections. Some of the popular travel bubbles that we've seen in the APAC region include the Australia-New Zealand travel bubble, rather the Trans-Tasman bubble, Taiwan and Palau travel bubble, and Singapore also has its own network of individual agreements with several countries within and outside of the APAC region. Today, we'll be examining some of these travel bubbles to understand how they work. Next slide, please. To start with, let's examine the Australia-New Zealand travel bubble. So Australia and New Zealand achieved zero community transmission by late 2020, thanks to strict border controls and lockdowns, and started exploring the possibility of safely resuming travel between themselves. One of the reasons why Australia and New Zealand wanted to explore resuming travel was to, of course, revive tourism and aid with family reunions. And it also helped that they were located in close proximity to one another. However, some states in Australia, such as Queensland and Western Australia, were reluctant to reopen their borders due to their own initial success in containing their outbreaks via strict border controls. So initially in October 2020, a one-way quarantine-free travel bubble was established where New Zealanders could enter some states of Australia without quarantine restrictions. New Zealand refused to open its borders to Australia travelers without quarantine restrictions until whole of Australia was open to New Zealanders. So in the meantime of setting up a two-way travel bubble, both countries began ironing out some safety measures to assuage the fears of community transmission echoed by some states like Western Australia. What the two countries did was they devised a scheme. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what the two countries did was they devised a green, orange, and red zone system where quarantine-free flights were allowed between the two countries, between green zones, which essentially have zero community transmission. Flights from orange zone, or other regions which have COVID cases linked to international travelers, will normally be paused somewhere between 48 hours to 72 hours, with returning residents subject to testing and quarantine requirements. And flights from red zones, that is area with COVID community cases, will be banned for anywhere from 72 hours and beyond, depending on the extent of the outbreak. So once this kind of a safety mechanism was set up, the two-way travel bubble between Australia and New Zealand commenced on 19th of April. There have been flights suspended between the two countries for short intervals since the travel bubble began due to localized outbreaks in Brisbane and Sydney in March and April. But overall, the system has boosted incoming arrivals into both countries. Air New Zealand and Qantas are currently operating around 70% of their overall flights on the Australia-New Zealand route since the two-way travel bubble began in April. So the trans-Tasman bubble is actually considered a success story in the APAC region. Now let's look at the case study of the Taiwan and Palau travel bubble. Both Taiwan and Palau historically have maintained good diplomatic relations owing to Palau's recognition of Taiwan's independence. And both are considered success stories in tackling COVID outbreak, at least at the end of 2020, when Taiwan and Palau had zero community transmission. And these factors helped both countries to start the talk of a travel bubble to revive the tourism industries in their countries. It also helped that both countries were located in close proximity to one another. So essentially, the first two-way travel bubble in the APAC region began between Taiwan and Palau, which was launched on 1st April. Both countries set up some sort of safety mechanism to prevent localized COVID outbreaks from spreading to the other country. And these include having pre- and post-departure testing mechanism for travelers, as well as travelers were only allowed to come in through a tour group and stay at designated hotels, as well as visit certain designated areas only to prevent any risk of infection. Additional measures include returning travelers to Taiwan were banned from visiting public areas for about 5 days, followed by 14 days of self-monitoring their health. And travelers to Palau must not have left Taiwan for 6 months and have no history of COVID within 3 months of travel. So on the whole, this travel bubble, unfortunately, was not as successful as it was envisioned, as group tour bookings dropped by around 50% within 1 month of its launch. Local travel agents cited high costs for travelers on pre-departure tests, as well as extensive restrictions where they were restricted to only come via two groups and stay at certain designated hotels and visit only particular tourist designated areas as reasons for poor uptake of the travel bubble. Currently, right now, flights between Taiwan and Palau are suspended from 14th May until around 8th June because of the rise of COVID cases in Taiwan. So overall, this model is not considered to be a very successful travel bubble in the APAC region. Let's examine the next model, which is the Singapore-Taiwan model. So Singapore in late 2020 wanted to resume business and tourism travel with low COVID risk countries like Taiwan, which had zero community transmission in December 2020. It also helped that Singapore and Taiwan are prominent hubs for international business in APAC, and they're located in close proximity to one another. So these factors allowed both countries to explore the possibility of setting up a travel bubble agreement. However, a one-way travel bubble was set up, with currently travelers from Taiwan being allowed into Singapore with reduced quarantine restrictions since December 2020, because at this stage, Singapore still had a little bit of community transmission, which is why Taiwan was not willing to open its borders to any travelers from Singapore. Singapore has maintained some safety mechanisms, of course, which include restricting entry to only short-term visitors for a period of 7 days, and PCR tests are conducted upon arrival for incoming travelers. Incoming travelers from Taiwan also have to self-isolate for around 48 hours until they receive a negative COVID result. Now, this agreement did not boost the number of international arrivals by much for Singapore. In fact, visitors to Singapore fell by around 3.6% in January 2021 compared with December 2020. And usually the visitors from Taiwan were mostly business travelers. Also, as I mentioned before, Taiwan was reluctant to reopen its borders to Singapore until at least mid of May this year because of the prevailing community transmission in Singapore. And they were hoping that this would be brought under control by this period. However, right now, the start of a two-way travel bubble between Singapore and Taiwan has been delayed indefinitely because of new waves of infections, both in Taiwan and in Singapore since early May. What the two countries have indicated is that the two-way travel bubble may start with borders being reopened first to vaccinated travelers. Overall, the success of this travel bubble scheme can only be gauged once a two-way travel bubble arrangement resumes. Next slide, please. We are seeing some common rules for travelers in the travel bubble scheme. Usually, separate travel agreements are etched between two countries. For instance, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore have separate travel agreements with other countries to ensure that the travel zone allows for direct travel only between two countries. Travelers cannot use one travel bubble to go to another country part of another agreement. For example, Australia and New Zealand have their own quarantine-free travel agreement. And New Zealand and Cook Islands also have their own quarantine-free travel agreement. However, Australia residents cannot travel without quarantine restrictions to Cook Islands via New Zealand just because Australia and New Zealand have a quarantine-free travel agreement, because Australia and Cook Islands do not have the same kind of agreement between each other. Also, travel is only allowed between residents who have, for residents between zones where they have stayed, where there's been no community transmission, at least for a set number of days. We've seen this in the case of the Trans-Tasman bubble, where residents are only allowed to travel between green zones, provided that they stayed in that green zone for at least 14 days. Also, travelers can expect testing and self-isolation. Quarantine rules to persist or be reimposed in the case of a current or recent outbreak. This was seen in the case of the Australia-New Zealand travel bubble, where when borders were just newly reopened to some travelers from Brisbane and Sydney, returning travelers were still asked to undergo some testing requirements when there were recent outbreaks in Sydney and Brisbane. Also, it's the same reason why Singapore has continued maintaining some quarantine measures for incoming travelers from Taiwan. Travel bubbles also only apply to direct flights between affected countries, so as to minimize the spread of infections from different stopover countries. Next slide, please. So there are some challenges that persist for travelers in a travel bubble scheme, mainly due to the ongoing fast-changing regulatory environment. So there is still a risk of travelers getting stranded abroad on short notice due to ad hoc border closures. This was again recently seen in the case of Australia and New Zealand, when there was a community outbreak, a small community outbreak suspected in Sydney, and lockdown measures were imposed in Sydney. Flights between New Zealand and Sydney were suspended at least for 72 hours in April. And this decision was taken within few hours of the news breaking of a possible community transmission in Sydney. Given the risk of ad hoc border closures, travelers will generally have to pay for higher price for tickets with flexible dates and travel insurance. Also, many travel bubbles are only open to residents of that country, like we've seen in the Trans-Tasman bubble scheme. A general trend that we're seeing is that the more the restrictions in a travel bubble, the higher are the costs to be incurred by the traveler. And this was seen in the Taiwan and Palau travel bubble, where travelers had to incur higher costs for pre and post departure testing and possibly made to stay in hotels, which would not have been cheaper for them had they had their own choice of hotels to stay in. Also, travelers are still restricted to certain tourist safe zones in some travel bubbles, as again we've seen in the case of Taiwan and Palau. However, travel bubbles are proven to be safe and beneficial for the countries involved in them. Next slide, please. Travel bubbles are safe provided each country has proper health screening and testing measures at their borders. For example, due to the health concerns posed by some of the states in Australia, what Australia and New Zealand did was they set up separate arrival bays for travelers coming in from their green zones at airports, and these bays are separate from where returning residents from other higher risk countries, other higher COVID risk countries enter the airport. So, as I mentioned before, there are some economic benefits that countries part of successful travel bubbles are envisioning. For instance, New Zealand in the end of 2021 expects to have recovered around 80% of the revenue that it usually gets from Australian travelers, which amounted to around $2 billion in 2019. And Australia forecasts that the travel bubble with New Zealand will pump about $3.6 billion into its economy and restore around 24,000 full-time jobs by end of 2021. So what will the future of travel bubbles look like? Based on the success of the Trans-Tasman bubble, more countries in APAC will come forward with travel agreements. Currently, there are talks ongoing between Australia and Singapore, as well as Singapore and Hong Kong for their own travel bubble, and Australia and Japan. So what we're likely to see is that countries are likely to enter into travel agreements with others which have a similar approach to tackling the outbreak. One of the reasons why the Trans-Tasman bubble actually worked well was because Australia and New Zealand often have the same kind of approach in imposing quick, swift lockdowns, localized lockdowns, even when there are few cases of COVID detected in the community. So this sort of instilled faith in each other that they will take the right measures to prevent a localized outbreak from becoming widespread. Also, we will see more bubbles being formed for countries which have high numbers of vaccinated residents. Already, Singapore and Taiwan have indicated that whenever they plan to resume a two-way travel bubble arrangement, it will be when a significant number of their residents are vaccinated, because vaccinations are already underway in both countries. Also, countries which have a better control of the outbreak usually tend to have the upper hand in a travel bubble arrangement. And they are generally likely to first enter into a one-way travel agreement where their residents will be able to travel to another country which possibly is still trying to tackle the outbreak without much quarantine restrictions, as opposed to allowing travelers from those countries to enter their borders without any restrictions, as we saw in the case of Taiwan and Singapore. Also, some travel bubbles may only be open to short-term travelers, as seen in the case of Singapore, as it would limit the number of incoming travelers and reduce the risk of spread of infections. So here are some of the key takeaways. Travel bubbles are complicated and they take several months to form, and the process can get stalled by short waves of infections. Like we saw in the case of Taiwan and Singapore, the two-way travel bubble has been delayed, and also in the case of Singapore and Hong Kong. Also, countries in the APAC are still likely to opt for bilateral travel bubble arrangements instead of multi-country travel bubbles because they want to test and probably see how safe it is to travel between two countries instead of involving more countries within that travel, within that quarantine-free zone as they test the waters. Travel bubbles are normally formed between countries which have good diplomatic relations and which already probably have pre-existing travel routes or direct flights. And this trend is definitely likely to continue going forward. A successful travel bubble will have more safety mechanisms but less restrictions for incoming travelers, as we have seen in the case of the Australia and New Zealand travel bubble, because end of the day, travelers still want to travel with the least number of quarantine restrictions when they're looking to resume the travel once community outbreak has been contained. So in short, travelers should be aware of all the conditions and restrictions that are there in a travel bubble in order to reap its benefits. Thank you, everyone. I would now like to hand over the floor to Aaron.
Thanks, Ramya, for your very insightful presentation. So what do travel bubbles and other similar travel arrangements mean for the recovery of business travel in the APAC region? As it can be clearly seen, despite the toll of the pandemic, many countries in the APAC region are keen to restart travel due to the severe economic costs of continued isolation. So as international travel continues to be restricted, travel bubbles are one of the main mechanisms governments are considering to really provide some semblance of normalcy and stability in order to boost travel recovery in the APAC region. Just to provide an illustration of how well received, for example, the Australia-New Zealand bubble was, approximately 150,000 quarantine-free journeys were taken in the first 4 weeks of the bubble opening, which was already 25% of pre-COVID-19 travel volumes. So there is a strong, it has been quite well received, and other similar models might have a similar outcome as well. So the relative success of the Australia-New Zealand travel bubble means that it is a model that will likely be followed by other countries in the region, especially those who managed to contain the community transmission rates and managed to contain localized outbreaks. Next slide, please. Now, due to the prolonged disruptions caused by the pandemic, the travel disruptions and the border closures, there is a strong and growing demand to restart travel, and this is particularly so in the APAC region. Traveler confidence is particularly high in China and Australia, for example, based on Expedia's 2021 Traveler Sentiment Survey. In a separate survey done by WIT or Web in Travel, 50%, so that is basically half of respondents surveyed in APAC countries. So these include major markets like China, Japan, Korea, and India. 50% of these respondents have said they were eager or very eager to travel immediately if borders were open. And this trend is a general trend observed across the region. This means as countries start opening up and more travel bubbles are or similar travel arrangements are implemented, more people will be eager to get out and travel. Besides this, APAC's business travel industry has not been as badly impacted as Europe and North America. This is based on 2020 figures provided by GBTA, or the Global Business Travel Association. Next slide, please. So for 2020, as you can see, for the APAC region, business travel dropped 44%, which is still a significant number. But if compared to North America, which dropped 60%, and Europe, which dropped 58%, it has not been as badly affected. So there is some positivity based on these figures. So what does this mean for the MICE sector? So the MICE sector basically is the meetings, incentives, conferences, and exhibitions industry. This industry, which has normally been a key driver of business travel, in fact, in the APAC region pre-pandemic, has seen very little recovery for obvious reasons. To give you an illustration of how important this sector is, APAC, together with Europe, were the largest geographical MICE markets in 2019. APAC, in fact, was the fastest growing market for the MICE sector before the pandemic, with an estimated overall value, economic value of $229 billion in 2017, with projections to reach up to $441 billion by 2025, based on a study by Allied Market Research. However, these projections were made before COVID, and obviously these numbers have to be revised again due to the significant losses sustained in the industry. So just to give you an idea, globally, the sector suffered initial losses of up to $42 billion in the first few months of 2020, based on data from the UFI, the Global Association of the Exhibition Industry. On a more country level, looking at Indonesia as an example, the local Exhibition Companies Association there recorded losses amounting to $3 billion in 2020 due to cancelled events and meetings and other exhibitions due to the pandemic. So what have governments or companies done to alleviate this slump in the sector? In response to this, hotel chains and governments have introduced in several countries, have introduced various incentives and implemented enhanced hygiene protocols for business conferences and meetings to encourage bookings and to drive some travel recovery. This alone, however, cannot spur recovery. Travel bubbles present a good opportunity in this sense for the MICE sector to gain some more recovery, because the greater sense of stability and normalcy provided by travel bubbles and other similar arrangements will improve the feasibility of meetings and large events to take place, or large to medium to large events. This is because the likelihood of cancellations will be reduced under such travel arrangements. Established travel bubbles or other similar travel arrangements will allow a much needed boost for the sector and to drive some recovery. For example, the long delayed Singapore-Hong Kong travel bubble, which will likely provide a strong impetus if and when it is implemented for the resumption of medium to large scale physical events. This is because both locations are premier prominent business travel destinations which host many major meetings and conferences in the region. Moving on, what is the trend or the prospect for general recovery for the business travel sector, or even the leisure travel sector for that matter, in the region? So based on BTN's Corporate Travel Index, has forecasted a stronger recovery for the APAC business travel sector in Q3 and Q4 of 2021, as opposed to Q1 and Q2. And this sort of trend of gradual recovery is likely to be expected going into 2022. Now, despite these positive signs of recovery, further infection waves and other accompanying lockdowns because of these new infection waves could likely result in the suspension of travel arrangements or travel bubbles between countries, thereby slowing down recovery. Just to give you an example, in India, domestic and international travel have been severely impacted due to the border closures implemented by various countries around the world, and even domestic travel within India itself, because of the latest wave of infections in that country. Now, in addition to India, several other major APAC markets are still considered COVID-19 hotspots. New infection waves, in fact, have cropped up in countries in the Southeast Asia region, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. So regional travel will have a slower recovery because of these new travel restrictions that have to be implemented in the event of these new waves of infections. This leads us on to the question of whether vaccines or vaccination rates will drive travel recovery. Just to give you an illustration, these two graphs show you the effectiveness of the vaccines in the UK, a country which has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. Now, due to the tremendous impact of the vaccine in preventing hospitalizations and reducing deaths, the UK has recently lifted restrictions on travel to some countries in Europe and outside Europe. This positive development provides some hope that vaccinations will indeed drive travel recovery in APAC as well. Now, the strong evidence of the efficacy of vaccines in significantly reducing deaths and hospitalizations, based on the experiences in the UK, the US, and Israel, for example, will definitely boost travel confidence in the APAC region as vaccinations ramp up. As more and more people get vaccinated in the region, the higher the chances of travel resuming, especially between countries that have high vaccination rates, as pointed out by Ramya earlier in her presentation. Now, 62% of Chinese and 67% of Australians surveyed by Expedia indicated that they would be more open or more comfortable to travel internationally if vaccines are widely available. And this sentiment is expressed across the APAC region, this general positive sentiment towards higher vaccine rollouts and being more open to international travel. However, one caveat here is that the slow vaccine rollout rate in many of these APAC countries is a dampener or a hurdle to regional travel recovery. Just to show you an illustration, case in point. As you can see in this graph, which shows you the vaccination rates per capita, except for Singapore, the major APAC countries or markets still trail behind EU and most of the EU and the US in terms of vaccinations. Because of this relatively slow vaccination rate, it would take at least 6 months or more for vaccinations in the region to truly make an impact in driving travel recovery here. So in the meantime, what can travel managers do to prepare for the current or existing travel arrangements? Number one, flexibility is key. Given the uncertainty of travel, most travelers have come to expect hassle-free cancellations for flight and hotel bookings, as travel bubbles can be suspended with little warning. Travel managers should therefore ensure that bookings made for whether it's a hotel booking or flight bookings, they should ensure they are fully flexible to avoid any of these hidden costs. Secondly, travel managers should regularly monitor travel restrictions. This is because country-to-country travel restrictions can change frequently and at short notice. Travel managers should be aware of latest business travel requirements of the origin, transit, and destination countries of travelers they are responsible for to provide a smoother process for both the traveler and the company. Additionally, travel managers should review and update travel policies as and when necessary to address the current and future business travel landscape. While duty of care has always been important for the business travel industry, it has now taken on a whole new meaning with more considerations to keep in mind due to this pandemic. Therefore, travel policies should clearly communicate guidelines regarding approved travel, what to do if COVID is on the rise in a particular location one is traveling to, for example, and the type of support the company can offer in the event of an outbreak. So in conclusion, as the stop-start nature of international travel continues for the foreseeable future, travel bubbles or other similar arrangements will provide some semblance of stability or normalcy to an otherwise uncertain international travel landscape. Travel bubbles, in tandem with increased vaccination rollout and a better facilitation for business travelers or investors by governments in the region, are key elements that will drive forward business travel recovery in the APAC. And while we have observed that there has been some gradual recovery of travel in the region since 2020, even if more travel bubbles are implemented or other similar arrangements are implemented, given the current regional uncertainty, chiefly the rising infection rates in Southeast Asia and South Asia, coupled with the slower vaccine rollouts, it will take another 6 months at the very least until we start to see at least a return to the levels even close to the pre-pandemic travel levels. Now, this ends my presentation. We'll be moving forward with the question and answer session. We have had some questions come in during the presentation and some very interesting ones as well. So let me start it off. So we received one good question here. So the question is, how can we hold employees responsible for when they are traveling? Assuming that all companies will have a policy that they need to be vaccinated before any travel takes place. So to answer your question, in most countries around the world, as in the example of North America and Europe, employers cannot force employees to get vaccinated. So it's not realistic to imagine widespread adoption of such a policy because of these legal requirements. However, organizations should have a plan in place in the event vaccination is required by travel vendors, business partners, or even as an entry requirement for specific countries. Testing and quarantines will likely remain in place for many countries as international travel resumes, regardless of the slow vaccination rollout. However, we will start to see the exemption from certain measures for fully vaccinated travelers. In the end, however, companies need to have a travel policy that can expand and contract and be flexible as necessary to allow for whatever adjustments that may lie ahead. Now, as for holding the employees responsible in general, the key is compliance when it comes to duty of care or duty of loyalty. There are many strategies that can be adopted when it comes to travel policy compliance, including accountability tools, robust and multiple channels for communication, as well as education. Ultimately, it's the duty of the company to inform their traveler, as well of any risks or dangers. Okay, we have another question here on what sources Riskline uses for COVID-19 data. I think Ramya would be best equipped to answer this one.
Thank you, Aaron. So basically, in addition to regular open source intelligence sources that we monitor, our team of global intelligence analysts also closely review latest public health developments from government bodies, and these include bodies such as the WHO, the US CDC, the European CDC, as well as quite a few private institutions such as the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and Oxford University, as well as the International Society for Infectious Diseases, so as to make accurate and timely assessments of travel and health risks. For COVID-specific country or territory data, as far as case counts go, we use the data from the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security.
Thanks, Ramya. We have another question. This one is on the Singapore-Hong Kong proposed travel bubble, which was paused due to a rise in cases. So the question is basically asking, do you think travel bubbles have been paused for several other countries and updates are only shared on short notice? Do you think this will continue over 2021? What are your thoughts on this, Ramya?
Thanks, that is an interesting question indeed. Well, the way I see it is that travel bubbles will continue to be cancelled on a short notice during the rest of 2021, because this is based on the trends that we've seen so far. In nations such as Australia and New Zealand, where governments have pursued a sort of a zero COVID community transmission policy. Travel bubbles have in the past and will continue to be shut off or paused if there's any detection of unknown source of community transmission. So also there is a fear of new variants of COVID that are currently emerging, that they lead to the closure of travel bubbles. New variants have increased transmissibility, as well as they are resistant to vaccines, which means that they are highly damaging even in countries where vaccination rates are high. So what we've seen is countries such as the UK have already learned a very harsh lesson of closing their borders too slowly to countries where variants have emerged, like in the case of India.
Thanks, Ramya. The next question we have is, how do we distribute, or Riskline, how does Riskline distribute our intelligence to our clients? So we mainly distribute our intelligence through two main ways, which is through APIs and through our own portal, the Riskline portal, the web portal. Now, through APIs, we push new and updated reports to our clients as and when they happen, so that they always have the latest information in their system. Using our portal, travel and security managers can access all services and reports in one place. Each portal subscription includes a global risk map and an alerts dashboard that is very useful in global operation centers. Options for customized content are also available, including user-defined risk levels. Besides the portal and the API, we have also recently introduced a new way to distribute our intelligence product, our widget solution called Travel Check. This is currently only available for COVID-19 intelligence. So it provides information on travel restrictions, testing requirements, quarantine requirements, local outbreaks, reports on any curfews or lockdowns in a particular country. So all COVID-19 related intelligence. But we are planning to expand it to other areas in the future as well, to other general risk parameters, in addition to COVID-19. We have one more question here on the politics of closed versus open borders in Australia. So basically asking whether an opinion whether the borders would be reopened based on whether pure medical science or whether it's also a political decision as well, given that Australia has approaching its next federal elections next year, I think. Ramya, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, certainly, Aaron. Thank you. That's actually a very interesting question and pretty much has been the debate in Australia for the last 1 year. The way I see it is that the present government in its political campaigns will be sure to attribute the tighter border controls that Australia has adopted as a key factor in Australia's success story in preventing a widespread outbreak compared to several other countries in the region. The border control measures, at least on incoming travelers, I foresee will certainly continue until the next federal election, which is slated for sometime before September of 2022, especially given that we have newer, more contagious variants of COVID, like the Indian variant, that are emerging. Almost half of Australia's population supports this measure of keeping borders closed to incoming travelers. But however, there is a sense of frustration that's building for residents who cannot travel to visit their families in other countries. So what the government might do in order to win the favor of this segment is that they may look at allowing some way outbound travel for those who are vaccinated, perhaps to low COVID risk countries, once more than 3/4 of Australia's population is vaccinated. And the government has previously indicated that they plan to have most of the vaccination done by end of 2021. However, With tighter border controls, what this means is that fewer countries will be willing to enter into a travel bubble agreement with Australia, especially given the federal nature of Australia, where there is a risk of border closure by individual states on incoming travelers, like how we saw previously with some states closing the borders to travelers from New Zealand.
Thank you, Ramya, for that really insightful response to that question. Indeed, yeah, politics, it's not just medical science, but politics which dictates how travel bubbles or even borders open or close. We have time for to answer one final question, but don't worry, all the other audio, other queries which we couldn't answer in this webinar will be followed up on, and we will provide an email response in the next couple of days. So the question, someone asked if there is a similar travel bubble in Europe compared to the APAC. The short answer is no, not really, not like what we have in the APAC region, for example, the Australia-New Zealand bubble. While it is true that the EU, for the most part, is a single or common travel area under normal circumstances, a travel bubble could only be formed among all EU members. It would be against the rule if it was only for a few EU members as opposed to the whole of EU, because it goes against the agreement. So I don't think we will see a similar sort of bilateral travel bubble in the EU, for example, as we've witnessed in the APAC region. All right, so that signals the end of our webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating and asking questions and just giving your time for this webinar. As mentioned earlier, if you have those who have questions, still have questions, we will follow up with them by email in the next couple of days. Thank you, Ramya, for your excellent presentation as well. And if you want, for the rest of you, if you'd like to learn more about Riskline or sign up for a free informer newsletter, which contains regular and insightful articles on the latest developments in the global travel industry or the global travel landscape, please visit us at www.riskline.com. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day, rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. See you.